2, 1. Take it, Gerry.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. It's June 4th, 2021. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Ignatov, who's the man who knows which buttons to push and has a lot of very intelligent, smart things to say and contribute. And it's an honor to be here with Rodney Ascher, the maker of many films that have affected my life. It's such a pleasure and an honor to have you both here. Gentlemen, the first question's really easy. But before I ask you it, I'm just going to introduce this series. It's called McLuhanMashup. And we're miracle workers. Well, we're not really workers, we're players. Because Marshall McLuhan said that communication of the new is a miracle, but not impossible. So we're playing in this playground, bigger ground of the global theater. We're sort of mixing up a soup, a cauldron, and we're going to throw in and ladle out some percepts, not concepts. We're not thinking here. We're just feeling. It's intuition. Okay, the first question is, since we're using this medium, Rodney, is Zoom real?
As real as anything.
Good answer. Clinton.
Yeah, it's real enough. It fooled me.
It's real enough. What was the last part?
It's fooling me. I don't feel like I'm sitting all alone in my bedroom one more day.
Beautiful. You know, Blake said, if the fool persists in his foolishness, it becomes wise. So, second question, just to get us started on round robin-ish. Why did humans invent language? Rodney.
Well, there was a book I read. It was presented as sort of a neurological guide to screenwriting, and they talked about language and even like sort of pictoglyphs as the first virtual reality. The notion being, primitive man was able to communicate in experience, let's say hunting, woolly mammoths, without and impart what that experience was like to a listener without them necessarily having to subject themselves to the danger of the hunt, right? It allows people to experience something vicariously.
Mm-hmm.
That is good. Okay, avoid the danger of the hunt. That's why Hollywood exists. I love, do you remember, is that Christopher Vogler's book, The Writer's Journey? Or do you remember the name of that book or the author?
I don't remember the author, but the keywords are like neuroscience and screenwriting.
Oh, that is cool. I gotta look that up. Neuroscience in screenwriting. Yeah. Okay, Clinton, why did we humans invent language?
I feel like because we needed we needed to squeeze out the excess of our imagination into something. So we it's sort of language lets us create this to communicate with someone is to squeeze out the moreness of just the here and now into other people. So that because you're sort of here and now, and then all the excess of the here and now, your memories, your past, and your projected future also needs to go somewhere and be here at the same time. So you kind of talk it through, bring people into those excesses of our spaces, be beyond immediacy.
You guys really nailed it. It's like, why do we invent language? To avoid the danger of the hunt and squeeze out the excess. Now, I try to do on these mashups to avoid to keep it in layperson's terms. So we reboot, so we find commonality. We reboot water cooler talk, hipster lingo, and academic intellectualism. But I got that question from a recent quote I read by Lily Tomlin. She says, we invented language to complain. Now, that's a beautiful thought, because I've also heard a cliche that I think has become an archetype, that if you complain and you gossip, you live longer. You get it out of your system. Now, there's a fine line between complaining and critical thinking. Now, Complaining is like I'm sort of aware of what's going on. I want to talk about it. Critical thinking is you see the patterns and you want to intellectualize them or think about them. Let's do another stupid round robin question. Rodney, did humans invent, is thinking more innate or more invented? I know it's both and it depends, but it's sort of like more. Like, is it more innate thinking or is it more invented?
Well, I'm going to go with innate. I imagine, I often, sort of remember, really early kind of interior struggles, those moments of being like a 2-year-old sitting in a sunbeam, trying to think about the little motes in that are caught in the light, and not necessarily having the language to talk about them. That's an experience that I don't think is taught from parent to child.
Dude, that's amazing, Rodney. Now, we're going to have Clinton answer that. Then I want to jump back on what you just said. Okay, Clinton, you got the question. Thinking more innate or more invented?
Yeah, it's innate. I mean, it's innate in humans. Maybe it defines humans.
Yeah. So, Rodney, I'm curious about your filmmaking and your approach. It's always intrigued me. I think it was the great Craig Baldwin who really connected us with your first super short. What's that called? The logo short. What's that called?
That's The S from Hell.
The S from Hell. What a film. And, you talked just now about seeing light as a 2-year-old and not having words. So maybe that was not to explain the light or to, you were experiencing white light. And that was an experience that happened to you. But you weren't going, well, I better write this down. And then in your learning language years later, you could go, oh, that's what I was doing. I was seeing that. Or so there's this phenomenon that you might know about, Rodney, is if you're driving down a road and you look in the trees, you're passing by in your car and the white light shooting through the trees. And it's like puts you in a trance, or do you know about this phenomenon? What is that?
Well, I don't know it as something that has a name, but it's certainly something I can relate to, like driving past farmland and seeing sort of the parallel rows as I'm trying to create the phenomenon in the zoom window, and I'm failing terribly. But like you see the path go from diagonal to straight for a second, and it kind of is repeating in a way that's almost stroboscopic. Sitting in the passenger window, driving 70 miles an hour on the highway. That's like, but it's a very private moment of kind of falling into that pattern. And even now that we're like consciously trying to describe it, is really difficult to articulate. It's something about parallax and convergence of lines and 3-point perspective. I kind of forget that. I guess your question was, what's it called? And I've got no idea.
Right.
But I vividly recall experiencing it, hundreds of times.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like mesmerizing, hypnotic, and strobe was the word you brought up.
Yeah.
So, that's sort of what we do. Okay, so let's start with Clinton this time on this stupid round robin question. Why did humans invent cinema? That's only now, Clinton helped me understand this phenomenon. You know how old cinema is? Basically about 128 years old. That's not very old. And then what's the other ones, Clinton? The internet is about 40 years old. The computers are about 80 years old, and the home computer's only 50 years old. So, we're thinking 130 years-ish ago, humans invented cinema. Why? So Clint, we'll start with you.
Oh man, it's motion. I mean, to have an art that captures motion the way, right? So it's one more sense, the kinetic sense, which means movements. The kinetic sense of things changing. I mean, before that, you got those little dioramas, whatever they're called. I mean, you can have a cuckoo clock, or or a wind-up doll. All these things are mechanized motions, right? But to capture motion in the raw, in its organic form, right? It's just seems like it's obvious in retrospect. How could we have not eventually invented cinema, right?
Well, it's just like, Rodney, you were talking about how much you love those glasses you put on.
Yeah, the VR goggles, the Oculus.
Yeah, and so it's like, how could we not invent that?
Yeah.
It went from what do you call those things that you look at as a kid?
The Viewmaster.
Viewmaster. It's just like an extension of Viewmaster. But you got the question, Rodney. Why did humans invent cinema?
Well, it was to win a bet, right? When Muybridge took the photos of the horse and stride, I heard that there was a high stakes wager about whether or not all four legs were ever on the ground at the same time, or were off the ground at the same time. Yeah. And his layout of those individual frames was originally still, but it didn't take somebody too long to animate them on some sort of zoetrope machine.
Yeah. But to win a bet seems
it's not the highest aspiration of mankind, but
right, but it's beautiful because it reminds me of Billy Wilder saying, I just hope they like my movie as much as they like the popcorn.
Yeah.
Because movies make money. I mean, have your movies made money because these people show them in theaters and sell popcorn, and then you get to make your living because they're selling popcorn? I mean, it could be part of it, but you've been successful. You're making a living, aren't you? Being a filmmaker, that's pretty dang good, and you're making stuff you want to make. Tell me. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to follow up, there's a really good point there, though, about to win a bet, because invention comes around with the right impetus. Everyone has the idea. Who puts it into practice? The story of the telegraph. There was a great many people designing telegraphs as scientific experiments in a laboratory to connect one room to another in the 1820s, 1830s. But it had to be Morse to go connect, hundreds of miles of land, because he had the drive and the commitment to get the funding and to do the research to actually scale this technology up to turn it into a global communication system, basically because his wife died and he got word far too late. And he showed up back home again. The funeral was already over. He got there 3 weeks later after receiving word she was sick, right? And then he was dying, right? Every night he had horrible nightmares trying to think about how to shorten communications across a distance to try and spare people the horrors of missing their wives' funerals, right? So having that impetus, that drive to actually create cinema, sure, a bet is a little less grandiose, but you're actually going to put the work in. You need a good reason to.
Well, I mean, I think that there's also I often hear a lot of talk about when inventions are ready to come, they're going to come, whether it's, inventor A or inventor B. It's just time for that idea to hit us. And there's a lot of inventions that came across simultaneously. I think there were two people who invented the TV, and Lumiere brothers versus, Thomas Edison. And there was an interesting book I read that talked about the telegraph and put it in a really fascinating context that said that the telegraph kind of evolved parallel to spiritualism, right? Because there were both ways of communicating with someone not in the room. One person was physically distant, and the other was, on another plane of existence to communicate with the dead. And then if you think of, once people were able to make recordings, well, then you can, have a one-way conversation with the dead anyway.
That was beautiful. Both of you guys are really enlightening. And I appreciate it because what I'm fishing for, Rodney, is more this question I'll ask you in a second, but it really is to just touch on McLuhan a second, is he said everything we invent extends some humanness. So for some reason, humans are sitting around, and one guy, one person in England, Baird, is coming up with the TV, and then Farnsworth's coming up with it in America. So yeah, it's just going to happen, but something's leading to it. Causality is like, oh, well, we have this spirituality thing happening worldwide. And one of the words that Clint used was communication. I mean, it's evident. Why do we invent cinema? Well, to communicate. Well, yeah, but the bet idea to win a bet was really what I want is the deeper, the hidden psychic effects. And it's like I say, I've learned, well, the obvious reasons are fine to discuss too, but let's try to go hidden psychic. And it's sort of like impetus. I don't even know what that word means, but it reminds me of impulse or intuition, or back to Lily Tomlin saying reality is just a collective hunch. It's like we're just guessing, oh yeah, let's all collectively guess this. But the flip that I've learned is biomimicry. Recently, I've learned this from Carolyn Casey, is that humans, and this goes back to the 50s, that humans can look to animals, plants, and figure out sort of like better inventions or good inventions. So they can look to a plant and go, oh, I can imitate that, mimic that, and invent Velcro. So the guy who invented Velcro learned his like system from the way a plant was. And so this is like, you wonder if humans invent things because they want to extend humanness, clothing is an extension of skin, knife and fork extends our teeth, but the eyelid is extended with film editing, or the shutter in a camera. That's what we need to extend our eyelids. Okay, invent a shutter. So all that's for grounds for further research if you guys want to react. But I'm going to go to Kubrick, who I'm so fond of you, Rodney, digging deep into Kubrick, because I love how many people go, I said, did you see Room 237? They go, I could only get through a few minutes of it. Or, they want, even though it was very successful, wouldn't you say it was successful?
Well, by my standards, absolutely.
Absolutely. You got written up in Art Forum and People Magazine. All the power to you. And it's like, well, what venue did you see it in? Oh, I'm on my computer at home. No, you have to see it in a movie theater. It's a movie. So all that. But Kubrick said the opposite of what a screenwriting teacher told me. He said, a great film or great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says, no, great film is when you clearly not see the intention. So, this goes to Clinton too, after you answer. What role does intention play in your creative process?
I don't know that I've ever thought of it exactly like that. But where I'm going to go with it is, at least these films that these documentaries that I've made, in the sort of very particular way that I put them together, it's in some ways it's very different from, a scripted narrative film, right? Where you have a path in a sequence to, that's driving the film from the earliest days. That, one of the most important things that I do when I make one of these projects again and again and again is watch the work in progress, try to forget that I'm the person who made it and kind of react to it as an audience member, and then, sort of critique it and revise from there, right? So I'm sort of filtering it through my taste and what I'm trying to do each time I watch it and saying, is it accomplishing what I want? Is it doing it in the way that I prefer? So it's about, for me, like 1,000 revisions that happen along the way at every step of the process. That's kind of my guiding light as I watch and rewatch and edit and re-edit and structure and resequence.
Beautiful. That was great. Well put, dude. Okay, Clinton, you're a creative guy too. Besides helping me with all these Zooms, you've made films, you've written articles. Your review of Rodney's most recent film is liked by him and me, and it's really well put. I love it when you go, if I was seeing this in a theater, I would have walked out. And Rodney didn't even go, geez, I liked your review, but did you have to say that part?
I was provoked.
We were talking earlier. It's like you go to USC to show your film, Rodney, and then at the beginning you make an announcement. And you go, "Hope you like my film," or "Enjoy the film." I go, "Don't say that. Just say I hope it fucks your shit up and you think or something." But it's the common way to say an intro. Enjoy the film, So, same question, Clinton. What role does intention play in your creative process?
Well, first, Rodney, I'd like to know if like a digital video editing workflow is necessary for the style of perpetually honing over your film the way that you just described. If you couldn't sit down and I'm going to assume, let's say you use Premiere or something. If you couldn't sit down in Premiere and constantly comb over the film and jump around as easily as you can in digital, would you be able to make the films the way that you do?
I mean, I think so. I mean, because I started making films back in the 20th century, and I learned on both a 16 millimeter flatbed and a what they called a linear tape-to-tape editing system. So watching and rewatching, revising was always part of the process then. I mean, it's made easier and faster now. But, there's a cliche about, writing a movie that you do it 3 times. And I suppose this were scripted film, in the screenplay, on the set, and in the edit. And, I think it may be that I was trying to describe my own process and maybe pretend that it was unique. But, trying to, I think, toggle between, being the director, being the filmmaker, and being the audience at the same time, in switching hats, I think is one of the most important parts of the process. And I imagine that's what you're doing on the set, with the scripted performance too, right? You're watching a pair of actors and pretending and imagining yourself as the audience and saying, "Do I buy this? What else do I need? And is this true to what I think this scene is about?" So, digital tools certainly make the edit more flexible, but I think that dynamic is probably in play in most any style.
All right, that's interesting. All of my creative work, I've terrible discipline and an awful attention span, and I've ideas go wasted if I'm not going to get up from my chair and sit down and start typing on them right there, right? So when I do create something, it's as fast as I can type, get it all out in one go. Or my documentary film projects took a year and a half of editing together a whole bunch of computer documentaries from the 70s and 80s and 90s and 60s, and it was like sitting in a digital editing suite, free one, Caden Live, and rearranging clips, sort of like a tarot card reader who's rejiggering the pattern, trying to get the right divination, right? So I'm watching all these movies, taking all these time codes. Oh, there's an interesting part at 6 minutes 30 seconds, 7 minutes 8 seconds, and I'm clipping them all out and I'm moving them around, and I'm waiting until larger and larger juxtapositions sort of grow out of it, and then, oh, this part over here, I'll drag it over here, right? So my intentions, I have no idea what my intentions are when I start something, Gerry. Just to get back to your question,
But it sounds like you recognize something when it is true to this intention, whether or not you could have articulated it earlier in the process.
Right.
You could be like, yes, that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, right. It's an act of self-discovery or continually trying to plunge in it, right? It's like doing your own dream interpretation. So it's kind of like I'm my own analyst trying to, sift through my own dreams through which I've tried to find in an external form through pre-existing media that then I'm trying to finagle into a collage that then, slowly takes a form where I go, yes, this thing which I've made out of parts that are outside of me are directly analogous to the thing that was in me that I was trying to say. And that way I get to walk away scot-free and say, I'm not saying it, these people said it. Because it's all documentaries of people with talking heads and their words and stuff, right? So it's like, you can't pin this on me. This was out there in the world already. I just sort of, I'm putting it together for you so you can see that percept out there, right? Don't kill the messenger.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it.
That was so good because Rodney and we've psychoanalyzed the scene in room 237 once. And both of what you guys said and articulated there reminds me of Frank Zappa's line, conceptual continuity. That it's, you've both worked in found footage, and it's like you find this thread by chance or by some sort of overall, I'm thinking of doing this. And then McLuhan called it complex clairvoyance. So, people in your past interviews online, Rodney, go, coincidence, serendipity, they sell this. Well, that's just the flow of the world. It's always there. And it's where you're able to watch it and see it and go, I'm going to pick up these patterns. But just the scene is so amazing in room 237 where you have Jack Nicholson in a Corman film on a beach. And then you have the bartender from The Shining. And there's some special thing that happens. And I helped you walk through that. I goes, did you know that and scam it? And you go, well, no, I went to IMDb and looked for these kind of clips, and then it's just like magic.
Well, I've got one for you from Glitch, if you like.
Yeah,
which
please.
So this is during sort of that really heavy sequence where Josh Cook is talking about the night of the murders, right? And there's a moment where he talks about the idea that, well, before he did it, he picked up the phone and he kind of reenacted this moment from the Matrix film where Neo picked up a payphone and delivered a message, to the Matrix, to the agents, the powers that be. And Joshua was able to recite it, almost verbatim, almost with the same tempo that Keanu Reeves did. So at a certain point, as we, kind of cut from the, the bedroom back from his parents' bedroom back to his own, we kind of move through the phone. We're cross-fading between the Keanu Reeves voiceover and Josh Cook's, and I'm like, at a certain point, I'm going to want to fade the picture up from the original Matrix film, because we're going to come back out of the TV. That kind of transition was sort of baked into how the scene was going to play. And I'm sort of looking for what's going to be the right moment while keeping these scenes in sync. And what happens during the phone call in the Matrix film is, they kind of do this electronic push into the phone itself, and you see like all the green, computer information. And then on screen is this huge title card that says system failure, right? And when I think about Josh's story and, the way that he describes, one warning sign after another that was ignored, and one possible moment of intervention after another that could have stopped him, that could have prevented the tragedy, they all failed. All the systems failed. Education, the household, the mental health access, gun control, one system after another failed. And it wasn't, as if that, it wasn't that I said, oh, I need a title card that says system failure here. It just presented itself. And I was lucky enough to recognize how relevant it was to the story. And that's the kind of gift that you get sometimes when working with archival, that it will, I have very little experience, with the tarot, but, I can imagine this, the cards that are offered to you. Hey, this one is really relevant. When you one way that I hear, people talking about, coincidence and things is, finding signal in the noise, right? And then when a pattern appears out of randomness, and that shot in particular, that moment in particular was, the height of serendipity, of synchronicity, of a coincidence that's on message with the story that we're telling.
Yeah. But Rodney, it's good that you say gift, because I really think you have a gift because you're a visionary and you've learned to study the patterns where you can recognize that. Not everybody can do that, and we're grateful for that. But in Keanu Reeves, I got to tell you another one is, as soon as The Matrix came out, he came into the bookstore I was showing experimental films at in Santa Monica, Midnight Special, and he bought all the McLuhan books.
Oh, that's great.
Because we know the people who made that Matrix film were deep into the McLuhan and critical thinking and all that. So one other word you both brought up is audience. Marcel Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. When you're making your film, how much are you thinking of your audience? That's a little different than intention, but how much are you, you sort of touched on it, but is there, what I like you said too, Rodney, was that you are your audience. And I'm sure, I've talked to your producer, what's his name? Tim Kirk?
Tim, yeah.
Tim is a great, I was lucky enough to interview like 7 people involved in room 237. So I know, probably Tim's looking at it, or I don't know how much you have people look at this. You're watching it 1,000 times or 1,000 edits. But in those 1,000, besides your team, how much are you thinking of your audience? Or what role does they play in their creative process?
Yeah, well, I mean, I want an audience to like it, obviously, but again, I mostly see myself as, sort of, I guess, the ideal audience, that I'm making the kind of movie that somebody like me would respond to. I mean, but that said, I watch it again and again and again, and I share it with the team. But every one of these projects, I also sort of do a screening for, maybe a dozen friends or friends of friends, to make sure that, well, to get feedback from them, to make sure that, because sometimes maybe some of I leave things a little too obscure that seem clear to me, but the general audience doesn't quite understand, and I need to adjust for that. But also, just sometimes there's such a value in just sitting in a room with other people watching it, and you can just kind of sense how it sort of changes the way that you look at it. That it feels different watching it amongst other people, in both parts that aren't working, cause more anxiety, parts that feel like they're coming together and feel good, parts that are unclear to somehow make themselves known better when you're watching it with other people, whether or not you talk with them. And it was funny when I screened a rough version of Glitch, with a handful of friends. One of them had an incredibly precise critique, which I wound up taking to heart. It was I think originally in 8 chapters, and he's like, you can't have an even number of chapters. It can be 5, 7, 9. Those are all perfectly good numbers. 8, there's just something wrong with 8 chapters. And I was first, kind of dismissive of it, because like, where the hell does this rule come from? But 8 does not sound as good as 7 or 9. So I think I merged 2 of them to bring it into 7. Because I couldn't live with 8 chapters after that. I would hear his voice every time.
Yeah. And one of our heroes and mentors, Craig Baldwin, he got all his chops from Bruce Conner. And Bruce Conner, where did he get it from? So it's always like
both guys are absolute legends. And
and Craig will, say I was, regurgitating Bruce Conner and, won't deny it. And I've said that to you, Rodney, you're the greatest Craig Baldwin wannabe going. You go, thanks for the compliment.
Absolutely. Well, I'm also a Bruce Conner wannabe. I saw his stuff in film school, changed my life. Did I tell you before about Down and Out in Beverly Hills?
Go ahead.
Because I'll cop to swiping from Craig and Bruce Conner specifically in film school. I had shot a couple of mediocre quasi-narrative films in film school before sort of trying to ape Bruce Conner in kind of cut up style music videos. But something I saw in high school that really struck, that never left me, and it might have sort of primed my pump to go for Bruce Conner, was there's a moment in Down and Out in Beverly Hills, the Bette Midler, Nick Nolte, Richard Dreyfuss Touchstone comedy, where the son of Richard Dreyfuss is a aspiring filmmaker. And there's a moment in the movie where he hands his father a VHS tape and he says, "This tape, it communicates exactly how I feel right now." And it's this Bruce Conner-esque montage of nuclear bombs and bikini girls and drag racing and giant Japanese monsters. And it was unbelievable. It was just a lightning strike through my spine. And it cut to Richard Dreyfuss kind of shaking his head and said, "Oh, my son, the filmmaker." And I was so mad. And for the rest of the movie, I was completely alienated from this character because I was like, that's a better movie than the one that you're in, asshole. And, I don't know if I've seen that sequence again since, but, it was a life-changing moment. And actually, a couple of years ago, for some reason, I got curious about that moment again. And there was an entire half-page article about its making in the LA Times. I wasn't the only person who took notice.
Did Mazursky make it? Is Mazursky hire someone to make? But Down and Out is Mazursky, right?
Yeah. No, he didn't make it. It was like his first AD. It was a member of the crew who actually had sort of the chops and the experience to do something like that.
Yeah.
A really energetic montage. It was really great.
No, that was a beautiful anecdote. That's what we're all about here on McLuhanMashup. So, I brought up Bruce because Bruce has this great quote that says, why'd you make your films? Because I didn't see anyone else doing that, and Craig has not got his films in People magazine, a little in Art Forum, but you've been able, through whatever means to go a little farther. And my question's really simple is, what do you, rather than me suggesting, what do you call your films? If someone go, "Hey, Rodney, what do? You go, "I'm a filmmaker." What kind of films do you make? What do you say? What's the sort of the cliche line? I know it's trying to nail you down, but what's just the form you say?
Yeah, well, I have to say, if someone, I very much dislike it when somebody when some new person I meet asks me a question like that. Because I'm always afraid they're gonna, be like, "Oh, this nut job," and so I find it very painful. And first I'll just say documentaries because most people know what that is, and hopefully they'll stop asking questions and we can talk about something completely unrelated to to this stuff.
Right.
But when they dig in, I have to admit that what I'm making does not look like an episode of 60 Minutes or Tiger King, so I might say experimental documentary, or, there's sort of in the overlap between, like documentary and genre films, right? Like horror, science fiction meets documentary, or that they're, subjective documentaries. They're more about, they're more about regular people struggling to understand mysteries than sort of hardcore pieces of journalism. I don't necessarily have a go-to 2 or 3 sentence explanation of it.
That's good. You got it. I didn't want to
Yeah.
ponder on it too much, but it helps me because do you consider yourself an essay filmmaker?
In general, yeah. I mean, I certainly have to see essay films as a big influence on what I do.
Yeah.
And a big part of these movies, right? 237 is clearly an essay movie.
Yeah.
My light burnt out, but
that's all right. We can see it. Yeah, right. We can see it.
Yeah.
But because Chris Marker to me is like the godhead and Zygmunt Vertov of essay filmmakers.
Yeah. I mean, I think.
Go ahead.
I think what makes my films different than most essay films that I'm familiar with is that the voiceover is not my own voice and it's not a single voice. That it's their essay. They're multiple. They're multiple narrator essay films, and the narrators don't always agree with each other, and that the narration isn't scripted. It's from they're from interviews, but which I think is kind of a critical difference, right? That an essay film is that the voiceover, is the voice of the film, and it is, often arguing, a particular thesis, and I kind of mash up narrators who may or may not agree with each other to ask other questions.
Yeah. No, that was good because Chris Marker, Sans Soleil, sort of the godhead of essay films. People wonder, well, you wrote the narration, you can read the script online, but this woman's narrating it. Is it more you made it up or is that you? And so that's where, and same with F is for Fake, Orson Welles, he's narrating, but he's right off the bat saying, well, this is a triple fake or a double fake. It's not just Spinal Tap and it's a fake documentary or a mockumentary. So that was well put because that's what, we want to do. Artists want to reinvent and invent their new genre, invent new, not just play the genre card, which is fine. Theo Anthony's new film is amazing because he brings up that amazing thing that the gun became the movie camera and then that the taser became the body cam. And it's like, yikes. So that's like extending human. But I don't want to hog this. I've done too much, and I want Clinton to bring in his questions and his dialogue. But, the form and the content is the other thing that, you brought up, the scripted narrative, like that when you said it's not a scripted narrative, because I'll tell you another thing I praised you about in room 237 that's so beautiful is that you never see the talking heads and you never really know, oh, that's that voice again. So, unless you psychoanalyze it with your pause button like I did many times, I figured out whose voice was where. Let There Be Light.
Yeah.
Very
Theo's
good.
movie, right?
Yeah. But anyways, Clinton, go for it. I'm sorry I hogged the first 47 minutes.
No, I think it's something I love more than listening to people talk shop. And both of you are very steeped in the tradition of documentary filmmaking just by the common language and the names you can all drop, and you've gone to film school, Rodney, and all this stuff. I'm completely outside of that, and so it's really fun to be brought into an appreciation of well, that's sort of maybe why I found your film provocative, Rodney, is because on the one hand, it's very much to re-employ the quote I used in my review there, but for the grace of God go I, alienated, oh God, I mean, I'm in a basement, aren't I? Basement dwelling, radicalized male come simulation believer sort of runaway subjectivity sense making thing, right? It's something I've been interested in since growing up, very internet heavy. And so your question, Gerry, about the intentions, your intentions regarding your audience, right? You started this long discussion with the question about, you know, what's your relation to your audience, and the relation that I initially had for my Silicon and Charybdis documentary series was basically to try and relate on a, you know, human level what it is true about computers to people whom, if they didn't really understand what their world was made of, I would be helpless but to view as NPCs, right? So it's sort of my way of creating a common ground to people whose world I don't understand at all, and they don't understand my world at all. And so people who are very, you know, systems thinking, computer software thinking, overly analytic persons without a tradition that they've inherited to speak of, or without a belief system, are prone to sort of just run away in their own private D&D style world building activity of, you know, the psychology of, oh, here's the whole metaphysics of the cosmos as it makes sense in terms which make sense to me, which are all computer terms, right? Instead, it's like, no, let's focus on the material reality of what the computer is. Rather than struggling to understand mysteries, how about I try to understand the mystery of why everyone else sort of got failed in their education as to what computers are, right? Like, why do classrooms today teach, you know, people how to use Microsoft Word and PowerPoint, and not teach them how to grab a screwdriver and take the thing apart and fix their own mistakes and actually, you know, own their media, right? Which is like my natural flow, right? It's a very mundane question. What sort of policy mistakes were made in education, which, you know, what warning signs are we avoiding? You know, like, hey, let's not teach people what computers are. Let's not, you know, create this sort of tradition which has this literacy that people can talk about in the public sphere. About, you know, these machines which are becoming more and more important, but everyone is everyone would rather not understand, right? So yeah, when it comes to relating to the audience, I think it was Otto Rank, which is one of Sigmund Freud's apostate, which means he was a heretic, apostate psychoanalysts, who said that the difference between a neurotic and an artist is talent. So even getting back to language, if you know, we invented language to squeeze out the excess, then you're a neurotic if you don't have the artistic means by which to actually then not only you know, complete what's missing in yourself, but also provide that as a common ground for the culture at large. What Otto Rank was trying to figure out was, why is it we can attribute some random artifact that an archetype, or sorry, an what was Indiana Jones? What are those dudes called with the hammers who chisel stuff and find archaeologist? Okay. Let's say an archaeologist, you know, finds an artifact from a long gone culture, and they attribute it to the culture as a whole. Oh, look, here's a Grecian urn. Oh, look, here's, you know, a Roman temple, right? Well, no, there was one person who made that artifact. So by what right can we attribute, you know, ownership of an artistic piece to be representative as a culture as a whole, right? This exemplifies Greek culture. Or, you know, to what level is the individual, you know, somehow we foist onto the individual, you know, the right to speak for the whole of the culture, right? Or was it just them, right? How much do we attribute to Greek culture the thoughts of, you know, Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, when at the time they were just a few fringe nut jobs who were disagreeing with everyone else? That they were the opposite of exemplifying their culture at a whole. They were the radical, you know, people who were misfits from their culture, but in retrospect, they seem to be standing on top and representing the rest of them, right? Naively speaking. So it's like the artistic creation. I think your question, Gerry, made me think that, you know, the relation to the artist to their audience is trying to create a new common ground precisely to overcome the sort of alienation, which, if you're not right, which might go wrong and through a systems failure, through the sort of, you know, solipsism of private world building that can lead you to think that everyone else is just, lacks consciousness, isn't even alive. These people must not even be alive. I can't get through to them. Communications don't even work. I'm a god of my own private universe sort of deal, which again, that's why your film provoked me, is because these are the levels of thought that I was experiencing, throughout the film. Which is why at the end I was like, okay, I would have stormed out of your film had I been sitting at the premiere, I'm sure. Just so yeah, that's my long answer to your question there.
Let's hear Rodney. Rodney, any of that resonate? Because that was beautifully well put. There was like a Greek poem. but what any thoughts, Rodney, that came up, or reaction?
Well, I don't know. I was so busy listening. I don't know. Certainly, I don't know that I have much to add to it. It was really well put. Yeah, I mean, that idea of, you find a particular artifact and prescribe it to the entire society, rightly or wrongly, is a really fascinating one. I mean, in some ways it feels like, well, that's just a function of maybe how little you know about the society, right? That if all you know, if as far as you can narrow it down to is the country, right? Other people might be able to narrow it down to, well, maybe this isn't, more specifically than Greek, this is, Athenian culture, right? Or the city block, or better yet, not necessarily conscribed by, geography, but, a community of like-minded artists that it feels like, it's a giving up, it's a shrugging of your shoulders to say, oh, this is just some Greek thing, right? Unless you really are arguing that this was incredibly typical, right? That this is, something mass-produced by the millions available at every Walmart versus, some one-of-a-kind artifact at a, at a small gallery. I mean, I really liked too that comparison between what the neurotic and the artist. I mean, to me, one thing that, that it has struck me, sometimes artists who create these vast series of works, and I'll make up an absurd one because a concrete one isn't coming to mind, but I don't know, somebody who writes, who inscribes hard-boiled eggs with tic-tac-toe games and does 10,000 of them. Well, if each one is selling for tens of thousands of dollars at Sotheby's, you're an artist. But if you're filling up every room in your house with them, you're neurotic. You're clearly a neurotic hoarder. And in a way, it's about the relationship of other people, how other people are reacting to you, not about what you're doing. And for a while, before 237, I was working on a abandoned documentary, about collectors, and I abandoned it because the subject was too wide, right? Of almost everyone is a collector of some type, and are we going to talk about, well, what's the impetus for people to do it, or or let's take a look at some interesting collections, or does a museum count? Does a kid with 100 Star Wars figures count? And I think one thing that became clear to me at a certain point was that, the line between a collector and a hoarder, is very thin. And sometimes it's about, well, do you have enough money to dedicate a room to it and build proper shelving and put everything on the wall, no matter how, and showcase it, versus, letting them accumulate and start to leak out of drawers and things. It's kind of a function of, how much space you have, whether you are a serious collector, or just a hoarder ready to be
totally.
who's desperately in need of an intervention.
There's a fine line. That was beautiful. Both you guys. There's a fine line between that, and I wish I knew you might have seen the film, but USC showed it in the last 3 months. It's a really great one. This woman's first feature, and she's made it for 20 years, and it's sort of like that collector obsession. And one person's obsessed with Elvis, and then one person's obsessed with something else, and one person's obsessed. So she tackles her own portrait through the documenting 3 obsessive collectors. It's amazing because I only got to see the Q&A, and as you know, sometimes the Q&A are better than the films. but you can see the trailer. So you see the 2-minute trailer, then you see the filmmaker talk about it. But what you talked about collectors is so close to where my head was going, because what Clinton brought up was media archaeology. That's what Craig often says. We're media archaeologists. I mean, that's what you are. You go into the vault of, Scooby-Doo clips and Corman clips and Kubrick clips, and this is the garbage. You're a dumpster diver and you pick up a few clips. I mean, now you can just put anything on YouTube and you can get away with it. It's so great what's happened in a way. And Duchamp nailed it again. He said, in the future, the artist will only have to point. So, I mean, anybody can point. Like Clinton didn't go, I'm going to go to film school and study Craig Baldwin and Bruce Conner. He just goes, wow, I can do a found footage film. And Rodney goes, well, I'm going to go to school and study, and I found footage is cool, and I'm going to utilize that, And so it shows you that Duchamp was probably right. How do you guys determine taste? So it's funny because everything's music. All art aspires to the condition of music. And my friend says the 3 T's of music. The 3 tenets are technique, theory, and taste. So technique is, well, you can study, film theory. What's this world about, the systems? You can study technique, how to do it. Theory, technique, and then taste. How do you develop taste? How does one develop aesthetics? Where does that come from? We'll start with you, Rodney.
It's tough. I think it's trial and error, right? Isn't it just watching and immersing yourself and finding this stray, kind of sparkly object, in the dirt that attracts your attention? It's weird. I always take a certain pride in revisiting something that I liked as a child and still liking it, and it's, I don't know who I'm arguing with, but like, that's right. I knew it back. I knew it back then. I could tell. But there's a Philip K. Dick phrase that I think comes from Dallas that became something really important while we were working on Glitch, that said, to paraphrase, that messages from the divine first appear in the trash stratum, right? Which is great because both thinking about Philip K. Dick's writing, that it was first published in sort of disposable paperbacks or in magazine articles, that magazine serials, in sort of the lesser pop arts, right? Not in literary journals, not in not in more highfalutin mediums. Yet his books are his books and his ideas, are still relevant. Though I think within the passage that he originally meant it, right, that he was literally talking about like seeing a stray phrase on a candy wrapper in the dirt that had some important resonance to him. But I also just love thinking about it like geologically, right? That you've got these different layers of the earth, and in the trash is where is where the messages from the divine first come before they're mainstreamed, right? And you think of generations of obscurists and dumpster divers and media pranksters who pull from that stratum of work, and eventually a lot of it bubbles up and becomes sort of a popular wisdom that becomes embraced by the masses. Not exactly sure where I was going from there, but yeah, I know I mean perhaps something that I take pride in when I'm looking for archival material in my projects, is that it's a nice mixture of, of the academic, the highbrow, and the completely despised exploitation, children's cartoons, toothpaste commercials, that I can find things to my things that go back to my taste, right? That I just have an instinctive affinity for. One that often I'll try to intellectualize if somebody pins me to it, but that explanation always comes after. First you see something and you love it, and then someone's like, I'm a big fan of Gus Van Sant's Psycho remake, and it is a wildly unpopular film. And when push comes to shove, people have I've gotten into arguments about it, but I always feel like I'm halfway making up my excuses when the real reason is I just like it. I know there's a speech by Ira Glass from This American Life that went viral, and somebody made a animated version of it where all the words dance across the screen in a very beautifully designed kind of way. And he talks about people who are struggling to be creative, and how the impetus for that comes from their taste, comes from loving so many things that they've come across in the culture. And then they, in their first attempts to do something original, if they find that their work isn't up to the level of things that they like, isn't up to that their talent doesn't match their taste, it's incredibly frustrating. And as often as not, it's about just continuing to go until you, I guess, find your place, find your voice, find your way. But he really had a great way of comparing your taste and your talent, and that if you didn't find some constellation of things that were really meaningful and powerful to you, whether they're the same ones that appeal to anybody else on earth. I think first you need that passion. First you need to recognize that value before I think you would aspire to make anything yourself, right?
Wow. That passion word was great. And
wonderful, yeah.
Getting the intuition as a kid. Oh, I knew I liked as a kid is but McLuhan's favorite quote, one of his favorite quotes is, "The Balinese have no word for art. They do everything as well as they can." Mm-hmm. So, that's you relating to the Gus Van Sant. I love that. But it reminded me of your hunch as a kid. I got to re-see this to see. So I moved out here 41 years ago from Michigan. And as a kid, Invaders from Mars fucked my shit up on TV, that movie. And so I get here, this is probably 35, 38 years ago, and it's showing at LACMA, the Museum of Art. Like, wow, it went from trashy TV, now it's going to be on the big screen. And I saw how cheesy some of the footage was. As a kid, I could not recognize that was just like found footage of the government military dudes. And I was like, whoa, that really got over on me because it had a big imprint on my head, like a lot of kids. Alan Rudolph even told me, he says, that movie fucked my shit up as a kid.
How did it feel to you when you saw it 40 years later, larger than life?
I wanted to be, great question, because I wanted it to still affect me, but I think it did what you reinforced just by saying what you said. I want to know if that is worthy of how it affected me as a kid. Is it worthy now? And in the big picture of sci-fi films, it's regarded. So, it doesn't matter. It's the user is the content, which is what McLuhan learned from Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce, which gets back to your Philip K. Dick thing. Philip K. Dick was a huge fan of Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, which he realized that what Joyce did was invent TikTok and Clubhouse and disguise it as a book. No, he invented this Zoom. He called it the Dream Theater. The memory theater. And the to get to the point about Philip K. Dick is that my friend Robert Guffey, great book writer, highly influenced by Bob Dobbs, is he said he wrote a really detailed article that all the sci-fi writers came out of secret police. Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and it's a kooky theory, but he really documents it. And then you get, and he's a huge Philip K. Dick fan, and you get to Philip K. Dick, and he was the only one who admitted it at the end of his life. He goes, "The CIA are after me. They've implanted me." And so most people just chalk it off as kook, whatever. I'm not trying to convince you, but it is back to your answer was trial by error. How do you form aesthetics? How do you form taste? People go by listening, by watching. You're a DVD collector. I know that. And you've learned by seeing and watching. And that helps inform your aesthetics and your taste. But there's something that you took back to your childhood and you go, well, as a kid, it touched me. So you didn't have your DVD collection as a kid. You hadn't watched a gazillion things then. So let's go to Clinton because he's a little younger than us. How do you form aesthetics or taste, Clinton? Because it's fun with Clinton how some of his stuff resonates with us, but his comes from a little different era.
Me and many of my friends, of course, we're all just pirating films like crazy on the internet 15, 20 years ago, right? So what you do is you go to IMDb. Again, it's just like your collector mania, except, of course, hard drive space is cheap, relatively speaking, right? So you go to IMDb and you sort by ranking and you binge watch the best 5 movies from as many directors as you can think of, and you trawl the information graph of who inspired who. And you binge watch the best of everything, and it's entirely outside of the tutorship of learning a tradition or a craft in a classroom. It's more of a manic, every night's a movie night sort of deal. So for instance, that's how I managed to watch Wild Palms just out of the blue, which would be relatively obscure to anyone who I spoke to, except that a few months ago I had the pleasure of meeting the writer with Gerry here. All right, there's a million obscure things out there which lie outside of the curated, managed garden of streaming services, which sort of popped out of Netflix more recently. And I've heard people online, say it's amazing how kids don't know that film exists outside of Netflix. And so there's kids nowadays who are like, how did you even, I didn't even know this existed, right? It's like, I've been on Netflix, I've been on, Amazon Prime, I can't find this movie anywhere, it must not exist, right? sort of deal, right? So
well, it's funny you're talking about educating yourself through IMDb. When I was a kid, one of the big guides that I had to resort to was the Golden Turkey Awards, right? By the Medved brothers. Which they called the list of the 100 worst movies ever made, which of course made them the 100 best movies ever made. But they ultimately end on Plan 9 from Outer Space is the worst movie ever made, which of course it isn't. But that one page, that one black and white page in that in that trade paperback book was the only information available to me for years before I'd be able to, it's going to be on channel 56 at 2 a.m. next Sunday. And I'd have to, circle that in the TV guide that, kids today, you've got it so easy, but it's funny for you to be talking about, a reputation of the younger generation only knowing what's on Netflix, when clearly those who are motivated have access to so much more than any generation before them ever did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's always, you can always just target the path of least resistance, right? So if you make it easy to stick to the walled garden of where everyone's legal rights and intellectual property rights are respected, then you can corral most people into whatever spectacular world of content you can divine there. Although I'd like to just, I've read Valis, and I love your reference to the archaeological dig into the the stratum of garbage wherein one can find the occasional glimmering glimmering pearl. Because obviously, like, I'm a huge McLuhan nut, and so is Gerry, and so that's why this web series is called McLuhanMashup. He wrote an entire book on that precise dynamic called From Cliche to Archetype, and it's all based around a poem by William Butler Yeats. Yeats wrote this poem in 1938, and he's reflecting on where his art has come from. As an old man, he's reflecting on where he even got the inspiration. And the poem closes: "Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but of what began? A mound of refuse, or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now my ladder's gone, I must lay down where all ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." So this idea of a rag
that's
and bone
amazing.
shop, the thrift store where you're shrouded in trash, and that's where everyone's ladder starts before you climb back out to create art, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think about the used bookstores, where I would rifle through stacks or even unsorted boxes. I remember stopping on a road trip through Florida. There's a town in Florida called Gibsonton, which is famous for being the place where sideshow performers all retired to. And there was a house there straight out of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre that I pulled over because there was a sign, that said, comic books for sale. And I suppose I thought that it was some sort of bookstore, but by the end, we led this gentleman took me back into some abandoned child's bedroom, stacked floor to ceiling with old boxes of comics. And I wanted to get out of there, so I kind of very quickly found 2 or 3 and then said, okay, I'm going to leave now. And I mean, he actually said I don't think there was a skeleton or a devil or some kind of monster on the cover of one of them. And he's like, "Oh, that's interesting. That guy's got that guy's got a devil on him." I think a lot of people do. I know there's a devil inside of me. And it's like, "That's awesome, dude. Here's $2. I gotta run."
Holy crap.
Where I'm going with that is talking about, as we talk about this trash stratum, this flea market, that similarly, if you're, looking through the bowels of, I don't know, whatever internet forums you're downloading your wish list of films from, that there's an awful lot of lesser work in the way of your sorting. Like there was, in bookstores, flea markets, this guy's childhood bedroom, and even if the location, right, of that garbage dump changes over the years, it's still in some ways a similar experience.
You guys, this has been so enlightening, because we went from highbrow Yeats poetry to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That is a mashup. That is a beautiful mashup. So, we asked for about 90 minutes, so we got about 13 more minutes. If you guys, can you hang in there a little more, Rodney?
Yeah, I think I got that, but
okay, let's wrap it up in about 10. So, just to jump on what you said for a second about Gus Van Sant in Psycho. It's very interesting because, making value judgments is interesting. And when I was a screener at the Ann Arbor Film Festival 45 years ago, we got a Gus Van Sant short, and I have my notes, and there were 8 people, and he got 0 out of 8. And he didn't get in. And then when he put out Drugstore Cowboy, we were like, this guy snuck experimental film aesthetics into a normal Hollywood film. Now, it's not a normal, but it appears as a feature. It's just like Room 237. The monumental moment is we're watching it starting at 9:30 in a big theater in Hollywood. It's the premiere screening, at some big hotshot film festival. And we met you and Tim in the bar before, and it's all like nice. And me and my friend, are older, and as the film starts, we both start falling asleep, because not because of the film, because we're just old and you fall asleep in a dark room. And all of a sudden I hear the guy on the film go, "And why did James Joyce write Finnegan's Wake?" And I hit Eric with the elbow. He goes, "Did you hear that line?" I couldn't believe it. So, you're loving or, appreciating Gus Van Sant's Psycho remake is interesting because he has a quote in one of my workshops where he says, "Films ruined my life," and then, he's telling his story. What did films do to us? How have films changed us? How have they shaped our behavior? And Kenneth Anger sort of nailed it. He said, "The day cinema was invented was a black day for mankind." So, we all know it's a language that we've used to communicate. You can say something and relate it. You can tell a new myth, tell a new story by bringing up the residuals of what cinema has done to us. We're all raised with films, no matter what medium we're seeing them on. And so, in that experimental mode, I would love to just read you very briefly what Stan Brakhage said about Tarkovsky, introducing, one of the great filmmakers of all time, Tarkovsky, at Telluride in '83. And Brakhage said, "I personally think there are 3 tasks for film in the 20th century: to make the epic, to tell the tale of the tribes of the world. 2, to keep it personal, because only in the eccentricities of our personal lives do we have any chance at the truth. And 3, to do the dream work, that is to illuminate the borders of the unconscious." Boy, that sort of sounds like all of your films. Well, summarized, Rodney. What do you think is any comment on those? And what is the aspiration for film in the 21st and 22nd century? What do you aspire to see or do?
Well, God, I mean, he's an awful lot more eloquent than I am. But I mean, the way I talk about what I've been trying to do with these films, I mean, it's sort of 2 things, right? That in some ways, like the big picture idea of these films has been to put the audience into the heads of someone who looks at the world differently than most of us, of people who are struggling with these different mysteries. And I guess when you talk about intention, I mean, one thing I was thinking of during this conversation was, my work has often been sort of divisive. It's some people love it, some people hate it, some people shrug, but I think that most of the people who hate it don't seem to really understand my intention. People who hate 237, well, I mean, they can hate it for all sorts of reasons, and many of them may be right, but there are people who hate it because they think that it is supposed to be a authoritative skeleton key for understanding the symbols of The Shining, which it isn't. And and the fact that people make that mistake is partly on me, that I could make that notion clearer in the way that I frame the opening of the movie. But, getting into taste, right? Taste and style, I don't want to do that. I don't want to put that set of training wheels on the film. And I guess I want people to be able to appreciate it differently than maybe I intended, because clearly a big part of that movie is about people experiencing The Shining differently than Stanley Kubrick might have intended. But if putting the audience into the heads of people who see the world differently, more than being sort of a Wikipedia article about a particular subject, and giving them all the information they could get about the making or the meaning of The Shining, or the science of sleep paralysis, or the science and the philosophy of simulation theory. If a big part of it is about, right, that notion of framing it that way, there's also, a big part of what I'm trying to do is kind of get the emotional aesthetic effects of the sort of genre that these ideas lie in. If The Shining and The Nightmare, are both about horror, right? There's a lot of horror imagery and horror aesthetics in those films, and even in Glitch, which in its way wants to be as like a science fiction horror movie, and that it wants to have that emotional aesthetic effect of sort of how that genre works, right? That I want it to be a immersive experience, an aesthetic experience, more than a piece of journalism, and all reviews are fair, but the ones that I take less seriously than others are the ones who try to distill the movie into any movie, not just mine, into a handful of plot points or a handful of ideas that can be gleaned, of facts that you can pull from a movie, that they can be, back to how, the idea of early caveman paintings or campfire stories being ways for people to vicariously live through, the experience of the hunt without, being at risk of getting gored by the tusk of a woolly mammoth, right? Movies are a way for people to, live through, these singular moments, whether they're down to earth or larger than life.
Yeah, seeing with new eyes, beautifully well put, very elegant. And it reminds me of these critics would be going, Room 237's got some really intelligent people, but then Jay Widener says you can see Kubrick's face in the clouds. That's going a little too far. And if you
Heaven forbid.
I was lucky. You had the balls to you had the guts and courage to put Jay in the film. And if you study Jay, I've had these interviews with Jay. We got to get him on McLuhanMashup, Clint. He's very intelligent and very thorough thinker. And so what? This is what he observed, and you had the courage to put it in amongst these people who were talking highbrow history and cult critical theory.
Yeah, well, one of the funny things about Jay, I mean, and you're talking about, I think before, what this ties into. Before you said that because we only put the people's names on once, and there was a time when I was considering maybe I shouldn't put anyone's names on at all. That it could have been even more severe. That because people often get confused of who's talking when. I've seen Jay's, each character gets, many points appears many times. That one thing Jay says gets called out as the dumbest, most idiotic, thing in the movie. But then another thing that he says is considered the most intelligent and the smartest, most penetrative thing that anyone has said, and they ascribe it to two different people, right? Yeah. I've seen each person, featured in the film, labeled by one writer or another as, either the best or the worst of the bunch.
Yeah, ambiguity is a form of human maturity, as Bob Dobbs says. So, Clinton, I'm sorry I hogged a lot of this. I want you to say any kind of closing thing you want, and then I have a closing statement because this has really been thrilling. And thank you both. So, Clinton, go ahead.
I love how Gus Van Sant, as you said movies ruined his life. That's hilarious. And see, that's coming from someone who took the time to learn to create films and was successful at doing so. It's kind of funny. If we could quickly touch on, childhood experiences. One time when I was like 5 or 6, the Rocky Horror Picture Show came on TV late. And I was interested, and my parents had seen it a bajillion times, right? And so they would change the channel whenever it got to the edgy parts, but I loved the music and whatnot. And the next morning, I found the VHS tape downstairs. I got up at like 6 in the morning and was rooting around. And then when my parents woke up, I said, "Ha! I watched the whole thing all by myself now." Ha ha ha! Right.
Yeah.
So that's probably a film which, when I revisited it again in my adulthood, really shook me, because I was like, right, like, it's kind of an example of this Frankenstein sense of if you fall in love with film, and this is probably much more true when back in the 50s and 60s, when falling in love with film as a medium meant showing up at a movie theater, religiously haunting, an establishment, probably getting a job as a projector so you can binge watch films, right? If you were to fall in love with a medium like cinema, you either learn how to create it, or you sort of just become a character in and of yourself, right? So that's sort of the archetypal, embodiment of Frankenfurter that I've always thought of, is the neurotic who loves cinema but doesn't become a film creator, but instead, speaks through the language of their aesthetic, the aesthetics of so many films, right? The glamour of the stars who form the constellations of Hollywood pop culture. So yeah, no, that's really funny. Because those are the people who I would ascribe are being waylaid by film, but even just entering the field as a director has got to be fraught with peril, eh? Or is it more fun for you, Rodney?
Well, I mean, it's fun moments separated by, wide gulfs of, fear and anxiety, right? That there's because of the nature of the beast, I probably, spend as much of my time trying to get a new project going, researching a project, reacting to possible other ones than I do actually, working on them. In those times in between, are as anxiety producing, for me, I think, as they are for, for anybody. I think every filmmaker, when they're between projects, have to wonder whether this one is their last, so that, and I think, like most of them, I'm whistling on my way to work when I'm in the middle of an edit, or I'm on my way to an interview. Though there's also a fair amount of anxiety to that. But in between, it's a desert of, of dread.
Yeah, that's just to be fair to Gus, I took his quote out of context, and Orson Bean said movies saved my life, but at some point he might have said, well, they messed me up too. And the VHS tape thing was great, because really quick, the question, I love to leave these sessions with the question is, did Kubrick pull Clockwork Orange from UK screens only for 30 years because he knew it was a good PR stunt, or because he was truly afraid that these kids, these droogies, were going to come and beat up his family, and I got to obey the UK cops who are strong-arming me to pull it from UK screens only? And my friend said, you could still go to London and buy a VHS bootleg copy. So it wasn't really, completely. And why UK only? So thank you guys so much. Auden, just to end with poetry, since poetry is outing your inner dialogue, and I felt we really had communication of the new here, outing our inner dialogue. Auden, the poet, said the mystery of art is that we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. So I'll leave you guys with that question. I want to thank you so much. I hope we can do it again. What a pleasure. Thank you, Rodney. Thank